The air felt heavy, oppressive even, as I stood frozen in our dimly lit living room. My husband, David, dressed impeccably as always, stood before me like a cold, unfeeling statue. In his outstretched hand was a piece of paper. I didn't need to read it to know what it was. The words on his lips confirmed it anyway. "Cherry, let's get a divorce." My heart constricted painfully, the sound of those words echoing in my ears like a death sentence. He pushed the paper closer, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Sign this agreement, and I'll give you an extra 20 million. 20 million. That was how much 3 years of marriage was worth to him. 3 years of me trying to make a cold man love me. 3 years of caring for him, of ignoring my own dreams, of trying and failing. I stared at him, searching for a trace of the man I thought I knew. But he wasn't looking at me, his gaze was fixed on some distant point behind me, as if I were no more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. "David," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of my despair. "What if I told you I was pregnant?" It wasn't a lie. I had taken the test just hours before, my hands trembling as I stared at those 2 pink lines. For the briefest moment, I had felt a flicker of hope that this child could be a new beginning for us. Maybe he'd reconsider. Maybe he'd fight for us, for our family. David's reaction was like a bucket of ice water poured over me. He chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I had a vasectomy, Cherry. That kid can't be mine." The room tilted. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "What?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. "You heard me," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. "If you're pregnant, it's not my child." The words stung like a slap. David was the only man I'd ever been with. The only man I had loved. How could he doubt me so easily? I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Save it. I'm not interested in your excuses." And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, clutching the divorce agreement like it was a lifeline or a noose. 3 years ago, my life had taken an unexpected turn. My sister, Jane, had been the one engaged to David. But just weeks before the wedding, she had left the country to chase after her so-called true love. Her departure had thrown both our families into chaos. The union between our families was crucial for their business dealings, and Jane's sudden exit threatened to destroy everything. My parents had turned to me in desperation. "Cherry, you have to marry David in her place. There's no other option." At the time, I had been unable to say no. Not because of their pressure, but because I had loved David for years, a silent, unrequited love that I had nurtured in secret. Marrying him, even under these circumstances, felt like a dream come true. Or so I had thought. The reality was far different. On our wedding night, David had handed me a contract, his expression as cold and unyielding as his voice. "This marriage will last 3 years. After that, it ends, no matter what." The words had crushed me, but I had signed the contract anyway. I had told myself that I could make him love me, that 3 years would be enough to win his heart. I had been so foolish. For 3 years, I had been the perfect wife. I learned his likes and dislikes, catered to his every need. When he suffered from headaches, I learned acupuncture to ease his pain. When his stomach issues flared up, I cooked him meals tailored to his dietary needs. I poured every ounce of myself into our marriage, hoping that one day he'd look at me the way I looked at him. But David's heart had remained a fortress, impenetrable and unyielding. Now, with the divorce agreement in my hands, I realized how naive I had been. He didn't see me as his wife. He saw me as a placeholder, a stand-in for the woman he truly wanted. As I stood there, trembling and broken, my phone rang. The sound jolted me back to reality. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother. "Cherry, your sister is back," she announced, her voice unusually cheerful. "She's on the afternoon flight. Tonight, I want you and David to come home for dinner." The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Jane was back. The woman David had always wanted. The real bride he had been waiting for. "Why is she back?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Her marriage fell apart," my mother said with a sigh. "I always knew that man was no good. He cheated on her, even when she was pregnant. She had a miscarriage because of him. She's been through a lot, Cherry. Be kind to her tonight, okay? Don't bring up the past." I barely heard the rest of her words. My mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle. David's sudden urgency to finalize the divorce, Jane's return, it all made sense now. He wanted to end things with me so he could be with her. For years, I had felt like a background character in my own life, overshadowed by my perfect, radiant sister. And now, it seemed, the story was repeating itself. Jane was the heroine, and I was just the placeholder, the one who had to step aside to make room for her happy ending. But something inside me snapped. I was tired of being pushed aside, tired of sacrificing my happiness for others. If David and Jane thought I would quietly fade into the background, they were wrong. That evening, I dressed carefully for dinner at my parents' house. I chose a sleek, form-fitting dress that highlighted my figure, a subtle reminder that I wasn't the same meek girl they had always overlooked. When I arrived with David, I saw Jane standing in the doorway, flanked by my parents. She looked thinner, her face more lined than I remembered, but she still had that air of effortless charm that drew people to her. As we entered, my parents fussed over her, their voices filled with concern and affection. David, too, was attentive, his hand lingering on her arm as he guided her into the house. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a dagger to my heart. The dinner was a spectacle of nostalgia and sympathy, with everyone tiptoeing around Jane's failed marriage. I sat quietly, feeling invisible, until my mother turned to me with a forced smile. "Cherry, why don't you help Jane get settled back in? She's had such a hard time." Something inside me snapped. I set down my fork and met my mother's gaze, my voice calm but firm. "Actually, I have some news too." All eyes turned to me. I placed a hand on my stomach, my lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm pregnant." The room fell silent. Jane's face paled, her hand tightening around her glass until it slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. David's reaction was more controlled, but his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. I met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "Surprise," I said softly. The tension in the room was palpable, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't going to let them write me out of the story. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. The dinner had been nothing short of a battlefield, albeit a silent one. Each glance, each word exchanged, carried the weight of hidden emotions and unspoken truths. By the time David and I left my parents' house, my mind was spinning with a mix of satisfaction and dread. I had thrown the first stone by announcing my pregnancy, but now I had to deal with the ripples it created. David barely spoke on the drive home. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I could feel the storm brewing inside him, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to tiptoe around his feelings. Let him be angry. Let him simmer in his own frustration. When we reached home, he finally broke the silence. "You lied," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut behind me. "Believe what you want, David. You always do." He followed me inside, his footsteps echoing behind mine. "You think this is a game, Cherry? You think you can manipulate me with some fake pregnancy? I told you, I had a vasectomy." I spun around to face him, my hands clenched into fists. And I told you, you're the only man I've been with. If you don't believe me, that's your problem, not mine. David's face twisted with anger, but there was something else there too, doubt. For all his confidence, a part of him wasn't entirely sure. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again, shaking his head in frustration. Without another word, he stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling from the confrontation. I had spent so long trying to avoid his wrath, trying to keep the peace, but now I realized how futile it had been. No matter what I did, it was never enough. David would never see me as anything more than an inconvenience. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. David had left early, as usual, without a word or a note. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce agreement he had left on the counter. The pen lay beside it, mocking me, daring me to sign it and end this charade once and for all. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Instead, I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Mia. She answered on the second ring, her cheerful voice a stark contrast to my somber mood. "Cherry. What's up?" she chirped. "Mia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." Within an hour, Mia was at my doorstep, armed with coffee and pastries. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a tight hug. "Okay, spill," she said, dragging me to the couch. I told her everything about the divorce, the pregnancy, and Jane's return. By the time I finished, Mia's expression had shifted from shock to anger. "That bastard," she muttered, shaking her head. "He doesn't deserve you, Cherry." "None of them do." I smiled weakly, grateful for her support. "It's not that simple, Mia. I can't just walk away." "Not yet." Mia frowned. "Why not? You deserve so much better than this. Why are you still holding on?" I hesitated, unsure how to put my feelings into words. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's because I'm tired of being the one who's always cast aside. I want to be the one in control for once." Mia nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I get it. But, Cherry, don't let them drag you down. You're stronger than this. You'll figure it out, I know you will." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I knew she was right, but I also knew that walking away wasn't something I could do overnight. I needed time to process, to figure out my next move. Later that day, I received a call from my mother. She was hosting another family dinner, and she insisted that David and I attend. I wanted to refuse, but I knew it would only raise more questions. Reluctantly, I agreed. When we arrived at my parents' house that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Jane was already there, seated beside my father, who was beaming at her like she had just returned from conquering the world. My mother fussed over her, offering her food and asking about her plans. It was clear that Jane was once again the center of their universe. I sat quietly, enduring their fawning over her, until my mother turned to David with a warm smile. "David, it's so nice to have you here. I hope you'll forgive us for being so focused on Jane. She's been through so much, you know." David nodded politely, but his eyes flicked to me, his expression unreadable. I forced a smile, trying to hide the resentment bubbling inside me. As the evening wore on, I couldn't help but notice the way David and Jane interacted. It was subtle, a shared glance here, a soft smile there, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. They were trying to be discreet, but I could see the connection between them, the unspoken bond that had always been there. When the dinner finally ended, I was the first to leave the table. I needed air, needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of my family's blind favoritism and David's quiet betrayal. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air a welcome relief. "Cherry?" I turned to see Jane standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I crossed my arms, leaning against the railing. "What is it, Jane?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I know things have been complicated between us. And I know you must hate me for what happened to David." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I made mistakes, Cherry. But I'm trying to make things right." Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't shake the bitterness that had taken root in my heart. "Is that why you're here?" I asked coldly. "To make things right? Or are you here to take back what you think is yours?" Jane's eyes widened, her face paling. "That's not." "I didn't mean, save it, Jane," I snapped, pushing off the railing. "You always get what you want. But not this time. Not anymore." I brushed past her, heading for the car. David was waiting by the passenger door, his expression dark. Without a word, he opened the door for me, and I climbed in. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, at Jane standing alone on the porch. For the first time, she didn't look like the perfect, untouchable sister I had always known. She looked small. Vulnerable. Humans. But I didn't let myself feel pity. Not this time. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. My defiance at the dinner table had sparked a chain reaction that I couldn't control. David grew colder, Jane became more reserved, and my parents hovered between concern for her and thinly veiled disappointment in me. It was as if I had committed the unpardonable sin of breaking their perfect narrative. But the most unsettling change was within myself. For years, I had been content to play the role of the dutiful daughter, the devoted wife, the quiet supporter in the background. Now, for the first time, I felt the stirring of rebellion. I wasn't going to fade into the shadows anymore. One morning, I awoke to find David sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. He didn't look up as I entered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Normally, I would have greeted him with a cup of coffee and a forced smile. Today, I simply grabbed a glass of water and sat down across from him. "Are you going to say anything?" I asked after a moment, breaking the silence. David's hands stilled, and he finally looked up. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say, Cherry?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe an apology would be a good start." He let out a bitter laugh. "An apology? For what?" "For treating me like I don't exist. For deciding our marriage was over without even talking to me about it. For doubting me when I told you I was pregnant," I said, my voice rising with each word. David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he closed his laptop and stood, towering over me. "This conversation is pointless," he said, his tone dismissive. I stood too, refusing to back down. "You don't get to decide that, David. Not anymore." For a moment, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. The sound of it slamming behind him echoed in the empty house, leaving me alone with my frustration and anger. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The crisp morning air was refreshing, and as I wandered through the park near our house, I felt some of the tension begin to ease. I found a bench and sat down, watching the world go by. Parents played with their children, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers passed by, their headphones blasting music I couldn't hear. "Cherry?" The voice startled me, and I turned to see Simon standing a few feet away. His ever-present smirk was firmly in place, but there was something softer in his eyes as he looked at me. "Simon," I said, my tone wary. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, sliding his hands into his pockets. I could ask you the same thing. But I'm guessing you're here to get away from David. Am I right? I didn't respond, and Simon took that as confirmation. He walked over and sat down beside me, his long legs stretching out in front of him. You look tired, he said after a moment. Are you okay? I sighed, leaning back against the bench. I don't even know anymore. Everything feels so complicated. Simon nodded, his expression unusually serious. Yeah, I can see that. But, Cherry, you're stronger than you think. You don't have to let them walk all over you. His words caught me off guard. For all his teasing and arrogance, there was a sincerity in his voice that I hadn't expected. I glanced at him, trying to gauge his intentions. Why do you care? I asked. Simon's smirk returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Let's just say I've got a soft spot for underdogs. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from my mother, family dinner tonight. Don't be late. I groaned, shoving the phone back into my pocket. Great. Another night of pretending everything's fine. Simon raised an eyebrow. Need a plus one? I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his offer. Thanks, but I think that would make things even worse. Suit yourself, he said, standing and stretching. But if you ever need an escape, you know where to find me. With that, he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That evening, as I prepared for dinner, I couldn't shake the memory of Simon's words. He was right. I didn't have to let them walk all over me. But standing up to my family was easier said than done. When David and I arrived at my parents' house, the tension was palpable. Jane was already there, seated in her usual spot at the table, looking every bit the golden child. My parents greeted us with forced smiles, their unease evident. The meal was a strained affair, with polite conversation masking the underlying tensions. I barely touched my food, my appetite lost amidst the suffocating atmosphere. Halfway through dinner, Jane spoke up. Cherry, I heard you're pregnant. Congratulations. Her tone was sweet, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that betrayed her true feelings. I forced a smile. Thank you. Have you thought about what you're going to do? She asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. What do you mean? I asked, my tone equally polite. Well, she said, glancing at David, your situation is complicated. I just hope you're prepared for the challenges ahead. Her words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. She didn't believe the baby was David's, and she wanted to make sure everyone else questioned it too. I set down my fork and met her gaze, my smile never wavering. Don't worry about me, Jane. I've faced plenty of challenges before, and I'm still standing. This will be no different. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Let's not dwell on the past. We're here to enjoy a meal together as a family. But we weren't a family, not really. We were a collection of individuals, each with our own agendas and secrets. And I was done pretending otherwise. After dinner, as we prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. Her expression was tight, her voice low. Cherry, can't you just let this go? For the sake of the family? I stared at her, disbelief and anger bubbling to the surface. Let it go. You want me to step aside so Jane can have David? Is that it? Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. You really don't care about me, do you? It's always been about Jane. Cherry, that's not true, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there. For once, I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't going to be their sacrificial lamb anymore. The weight of my mother's words clung to me like a storm cloud as David and I drove home in silence. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color, my mind racing. For years, I had sacrificed my happiness to keep the peace, to fulfill their expectations. But tonight, I had drawn a line. I had chosen myself for the first time in a long time. When we arrived home, David headed straight to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room. I could feel the tension radiating from him, his anger simmering just below the surface. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I was too drained to fight another battle. Instead, I sank onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. The house felt unbearably quiet, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. My thoughts drifted to the baby growing inside me, the one thing that kept me grounded amidst the chaos. This child was mine, a piece of me that no one could take away. As I sat there, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another message from my mother or Jane. But it wasn't them. It was Simon. "Hey, just checking in. You okay?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Simon had always been a wild card in my life, unpredictable and infuriating. But at that moment, his concern felt genuine. I typed a quick reply before I could overthink it. "I've been better. Thanks for asking." His response came almost immediately. "Want to talk? I can bring ice cream." A small smile tugged at my lips despite everything. Simon had a knack for cutting through the gloom with his casual charm. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "No need. I just need some time to think." "Fair enough. But remember, I'm just a call away if you need me." The exchange left me feeling oddly comforted. Simon's presence in my life was complicated, but at least he didn't expect anything from me. Unlike everyone else, he didn't try to control or define me. It was refreshing and dangerous. The next day, I decided to visit my doctor for a routine checkup. The baby's health was my top priority, and I wanted to make sure everything was progressing smoothly. As I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by expectant mothers and their partners, I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. They looked so happy, so united. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil in my own life. When the nurse called my name, I followed her into the examination room. Dr. Patel greeted me with a warm smile, her kind eyes putting me at ease. "How are you feeling, Cherry?" she asked, gesturing for me to sit on the examination table. "I'm doing okay," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a little stressed." She nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable. Pregnancy can be overwhelming, especially with everything else going on. Let's check on the baby and make sure everything's on track." As she performed the ultrasound, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. It was a steady, reassuring rhythm that brought tears to my eyes. Dr. Patel turned the screen toward me, pointing out the tiny life growing inside me. "Everything looks great," she said. "The baby is healthy and developing perfectly." Relief washed over me, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. No matter what happened with David, Jane, or my family, I had this. I had my baby, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, I decided to stop by a nearby cafe for some tea. As I sipped my drink, I noticed a familiar figure walking past the window. It was Simon, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowded street. He spotted me and grinned, changing course to join me inside. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "How's the tea?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you stalking me now?" He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Pure coincidence, I swear. But since I'm here, I might as well keep you company." I rolled my eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. Simon had an uncanny ability to inject levity into any situation, and right now, I needed the distraction. We chatted for a while, the conversation flowing easily. Simon's stories about his misadventures were ridiculous and entertaining, and I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. For a little while, I forgot about my troubles and simply enjoyed the moment. "You're different," Simon said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. I blinked, caught off guard. "Different how?" "More confident. Stronger." "It suits you," he said, his gaze steady. His words struck a chord, and I felt a surge of gratitude. Simon might be infuriating at times, but he had an uncanny way of seeing through my walls. He saw the parts of me that I had buried, the strength I was only beginning to rediscover. "Thanks," I said softly. "That means a lot." When I returned home that evening, I found David waiting for me in the living room. His expression was guarded, his posture tense. I set my bag down and crossed my arms, bracing myself for whatever he had to say. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "About?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "About us. About the baby." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the baby you claim isn't yours?" David flinched, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he took a deep breath and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. Reluctantly, I joined him, keeping a safe distance between us. I might have been wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the vasectomy. I didn't exactly follow up with the doctor afterward." The revelation stunned me into silence. After everything he had put me through, he was only now admitting this? Anger flared within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So what are you saying, David?" I asked, my voice steady. He met my gaze, his expression conflicted. "I don't know. I think we need to figure this out together." His words were a stark contrast to his earlier behavior, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down. Trust wasn't something I could give him easily, not after everything he had done. "I'll think about it," I said finally, rising to my feet. "But don't expect me to make any decisions right now." David nodded, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world rested on them. I left him sitting there and retreated to the bedroom, my thoughts a tangled mess. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. David's words replayed in my mind, along with Simon's unexpected kindness. My life felt like a storm, with every piece spinning out of control. But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: I couldn't keep living like this. It was time to take control, to carve out a future for myself and my child, no matter how uncertain it seemed. In the days that followed, I found myself torn between two paths. On one hand, David's reluctant admission about the vasectomy hinted at the possibility of reconciliation, or at least a truce. On the other hand, there was Simon, the ever-present wildcard who seemed intent on carving a space for himself in my chaotic life. But above all, I was focused on my child, the tiny life growing inside me. They were my anchor, my reason to keep moving forward. One afternoon, as I sat in my little garden tending to the flowers I had planted months ago, Simon's voice cut through the stillness. "You know, staring at those flowers won't solve your problems." I looked up to see him leaning against the gate, a familiar smirk tugging at his lips. He was holding a brown paper bag, which he waved in my direction. "I brought lunch," he announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I sighed, brushing dirt off my hands. "Do you ever ask before barging into someone's life?" "Nope," he said cheerfully, setting the bag on the patio table. "But you secretly love it." I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. Simon had a way of injecting lightness into even the heaviest moments, and for that, I was begrudgingly grateful. We ate in companionable silence, the warm breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers. For a while, it almost felt normal, like we were two old friends catching up instead of two people navigating a minefield of emotions and unspoken complications. "So," Simon said, breaking the silence. "What's your plan?" I looked at him, confused. "Plan for what?" "For your life, Cherry. For you and the baby." "What's next?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so consumed by the day-to-day drama that I hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm just trying to take it one day at a time." Simon's expression softened, and for once, there was no teasing in his voice. "You deserve better than this, you know. You deserve to be happy." His words hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, blinking back tears. "I don't even know what happiness looks like anymore," I said quietly. Simon reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Then it's time to find out." Later that evening, as I sat in the living room sorting through old photographs, David came home. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. He paused in the doorway, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he looked away. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice subdued. I nodded, setting the photos aside. He sat down across from me, his posture tense. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "About us. About everything." I waited, unsure of where he was going with this. I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've taken you for granted. I didn't realize how much you've sacrificed for me, for this marriage." His words should have made me feel something, relief, vindication, maybe even hope. But instead, they felt hollow, too little too late. "Why now?" I asked, my voice steady. "Why are you saying this now?" David hesitated, his hands clenched into fists. "Because I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." I looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. There was a part of me that wanted to believe him, to believe that he could change. But the scars of the past 3 years were too deep to ignore. "David," I said softly, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "Cherry, please." I need time," I interrupted, cutting him off. "Time to figure out what's best for me and the baby." He nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. The following week, I threw myself into planning for the baby's arrival. I started researching parenting books, decorating the nursery, and making lists of everything I'd need. It was a welcome distraction, a way to focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past. Simon, true to form, popped in frequently, offering unsolicited advice and questionable jokes. Despite his antics, he was a surprisingly steady presence, always ready to lend a hand or an ear when I needed it. "Are you sure you don't want me to paint the nursery?" he asked one afternoon, holding up a paintbrush with a grin. "Absolutely not," I said, laughing. "The last thing I need is you turning it into a mural of your face." "You wound me," he said, clutching his chest dramatically. "But fine, I'll stick to moral support." Despite his teasing, Simon's presence was a source of comfort. He never pushed, never demanded more than I was willing to give. He was simply there, and that was enough. One evening, as I sat on the couch sorting through baby clothes, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jane. "We need to talk. Can we meet tomorrow?" I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting with unease. I had avoided Jane since the dinner at my parents' house, unwilling to confront the mess of emotions she stirred in me. But I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. "Fine. Meet me at the park at noon." Her response came quickly. "Thank you." The next day, I arrived at the park a few minutes early, my nerves frayed. Jane was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. "Thanks for coming," she said, standing as I reached her. "What do you want, Jane?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She winced but didn't back down. "I wanted to apologize. For everything." I crossed my arms, waiting for her to continue. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know I've been selfish. But I want to make things right." Her words stirred a whirlwind of emotions in me, anger, sadness, and a tiny flicker of hope. But I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. "Making things right doesn't erase the past," I said quietly. "It doesn't change what you did." "I know," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I'm trying, Cherry. I'm trying to be better." For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving her to deal with the consequences of her actions. But then I thought of my child, of the future I wanted to build for them. Holding on to anger wouldn't help me move forward. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice softening. "But don't expect forgiveness overnight." Jane nodded, her relief evident. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. The park meeting with Jane marked a turning point for me. While I wasn't ready to fully forgive her, our conversation had sparked a small sense of closure. For too long, I had let her shadow dictate my life, but now, I felt the first inklings of freedom. My focus shifted entirely to the future, a future I would shape for myself and my child. A few weeks later, I stood in the nursery, admiring the transformation. The once bare walls were now painted in soothing shades of green, adorned with delicate illustrations of animals and trees. A white crib sat in the corner, its soft bedding neatly arranged. It was a room filled with promise and love, a space where my baby could thrive. As I adjusted a stuffed elephant on the shelf, my phone buzzed on the dresser. It was David. I hesitated before answering. Our conversations had been civil but strained since his hesitant admission about the vasectomy. I braced myself as I picked up the call. "Hello?" "Cherry," he began, his voice tinged with nervousness. "I was hoping we could meet. There's something I need to talk to you about." My first instinct was to refuse, but something in his tone stopped me. "All right. When?" "Tonight." "Dinner," he suggested. "Fine," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'm not promising anything." That evening, I arrived at the restaurant to find David already waiting at a secluded corner table. He looked different, tired, vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the confident, aloof man I had married. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down. "What's this about, David?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly on the table. I want to start over, Cherry. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I stared at him, disbelief mingling with anger. "Start over? After everything? After you doubted me, dismissed me, and treated me like I was nothing?" "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't realize what I had until I was about to lose it. You're an amazing woman, Cherry, and I want to be the husband you deserve." His words might have moved me once, but now, they felt hollow. I thought of all the nights I had cried myself to sleep, the countless ways I had tried to prove my worth to him. And then I thought of Simon, who had accepted me as I was without asking for anything in return. "David," I said, my voice steady, "it's too late. I've spent years trying to make this marriage work, and all I got in return was heartache. I deserve better than that. My child deserves better than that." He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I've made my decision," I said firmly. "I want a divorce. And this time, I mean it." David's face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the strength it had taken to reach this point, the resolve I had found within myself. I wasn't going to back down. The next few weeks passed in a blur. David and I finalized the divorce, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I moved into a cozy townhouse, a space that was entirely mine, and threw myself into preparations for the baby's arrival. Simon, of course, was a constant presence. He showed up unannounced with groceries, baby supplies, and his trademark charm. Despite my initial reluctance, I found myself leaning on him more and more. He had a way of making the difficult days seem manageable, his humor and kindness a balm for my weary soul. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Simon turned to me with an uncharacteristically serious expression. "Cherry, can I ask you something?" I muted the TV and looked at him. "What is it?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to be part of your life. You and the baby. Not just as a friend, but as more." The sincerity in his eyes took my breath away. Simon had always been a wild card, but in that moment, he was steady and sure. "Simon," I began, my voice faltering. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. I've been through so much, and I'm still figuring things out." He nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. And I'm not asking you to rush into anything. I'll wait for as long as it takes. Just know that I'm here for you. Always." His words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had felt alone, unloved. But here was Simon, offering me a chance at something real, something beautiful. When the day finally came, I held my baby for the first time, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of love and joy. They were perfect, their tiny fingers wrapping around mine as I whispered promises of love and protection. Simon was there too, waiting just outside the room. When he finally came in, his face lit up at the sight of the baby. "They're beautiful, Cherry," he said softly, his eyes filled with wonder. I smiled through my tears. "Thank you for being here." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he said, his voice steady. At that moment, I realized that Simon wasn't just a wild card. He was my partner, my support, and maybe, just maybe, my future. Years later, as I watched Simon chase our giggling child around the yard, I felt a sense of contentment I had never known before. Life hadn't turned out the way I had planned, but it had brought me to a place of love and happiness. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. Simon caught our child and swung them into the air, their laughter ringing out like music. He looked over at me, his eyes sparkling with joy. "You're next," he called, grinning mischievously. I laughed, shaking my head. Not a chance. But as I watched him, I couldn't help but feel like the luckiest person in the world. For the first time, I was truly, undeniably happy.